The morning at Cedar Ridge High School should have been ordinary. Bright mountain air, chatter of teenagers, the smell of coffee drifting from the teacher's lounge. Nothing suggested danger. Nothing hinted that a single instinct, from a single dog, would prevent the unthinkable. Officer Mark Dalton walked the hallway with Ranger, his 5-year-old Belgian Malinois. Students waved at the dog. Ranger usually acknowledged them with a calm blink, a steady trot, a professional composure that made everyone feel safe. But not today. As they approached locker 312, Ranger slowed. His ears pricked forward. His tail froze mid-swing. Then he sat, firm, unmoving, like a statue carved from muscle and instinct. "Ranger." "What's up, buddy?" Mark whispered. Ranger didn't glance at him. Instead, the dog leaned in, nose almost touching the metal door. His breathing shifted, short, sharp, controlled. A warning pattern Mark knew from his years in the Army. Students began turning their heads. A few pulled out earbuds. Something about the dog's stillness felt wrong. Mark tugged the leash gently. Ranger refused to move. And then, just as Mark bent down to check Ranger's paws, the wall beside the locker made a sound so faint, only a trained ear, or a terrified silence, could catch it. Tick, tick, tick. A cold line ran down Mark's spine. Ranger's growl rumbled like distant thunder, and the school day, once ordinary, shifted into something else entirely. Cedar Ridge sat high in the Colorado foothills, tucked between red rock cliffs and long stretches of open prairie. Life there moved at a slower rhythm. Farm trucks rumbling past diners, kids biking to school, neighbors greeting each other by name. The kind of town where everyone trusted the quiet, where parents felt safe sending their children to school without a second thought. Officer Mark Dalton had been part of that safety net for nearly 4 years. Every weekday at 7 a.m., he and Ranger walked the campus perimeter, checking doors, greeting students, making sure trouble never got a foothold. To most people, Mark was just a calm officer with a steady smile. Few knew he had once served as an EOD specialist, a bomb technician, whose hearing still carried the ghosts of explosions in distant deserts. Ranger had been assigned to him after Mark returned from Afghanistan. At first, Ranger was just a partner, a task, a responsibility, but over time, the dog became something else. A grounding presence in Mark's life as a single father. A gentle shadow in his home. And the only living being who understood the way Mark sometimes froze when he heard sudden, sharp noises. Ranger wasn't like other canines. He was calmer, more observant, almost intuitive. Once, he pulled Mark toward a crying freshman hiding behind the bleachers. Another time, he alerted the staff to a diabetic student with dangerously low blood sugar. The school used to joke that Ranger wasn't just a police dog. He was Cedar Ridge's guardian angel on 4 paws. That morning began exactly like the hundreds before it. Students filed through the metal detector gates. Backpacks thumped on the ground. There were too many hoodies for the warm weather. Too many iced coffees for kids who barely slept. A group of seniors debated which fast food place had the best breakfast burrito. A teacher hurried by with an armful of ungraded essays. Someone's phone played country music too loudly. Mark breathed in the familiar noise, the familiar routine. Ranger padded beside him, tail relaxed, scanning faces with gentle curiosity. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. They walked past the trophy case, glinting with state championship medals, past the mural painted by last year's art class, past the row of lockers that always stuck when humidity rose. The sound of kids laughing bounced off the walls. Someone called Ranger's name. Another student scratched behind his ears, earning a soft huff of approval. It was the picture of a perfect school morning. Which is why what happened next, what Ranger sensed before any human eye or ear could, would shake everyone's belief that Cedar Ridge was the kind of town where nothing bad ever happens. Because trouble was already inside the building, hidden, silent, counting down. And only Ranger knew. To understand what happened in front of locker 312, you first have to understand who Ranger was. Ranger wasn't the loud, high-energy type of police dog that barked at every shadow or reacted to every sudden movement. He was the opposite, quiet, steady, almost monk-like in the way he observed the world. His trainers used to joke that Ranger didn't just see things. He read them. Every shift of air, every tremble of sound, every strange vibration that most people dismissed as nothing. Mark first met him 3 years earlier at a K-9 unit evaluation in Denver. Other dogs tugged at their leashes, panting with excitement. Ranger stood completely still, eyes locked onto Mark with an intensity that felt almost human. Mark remembered stopping in his tracks, because for the first time in a long while, something looked straight into him without judgment, without fear, without pity, just understanding. Ranger had a scar across his right flank, the result of a training incident during his early explosive detection program. But instead of making him skittish, it made him sharper. He learned to pay attention to tiny cues, the faintest chemical trace, the softest air pressure shift, the tiniest metallic click. What really surprised his handlers was his ability to detect pattern changes, sounds or smells that didn't match the environment. In Afghanistan, Mark had survived because of instincts just like that. Ranger had never seen war, yet somehow he carried war instincts in his bones. The bond between the two formed fast. Not just partnership, synchronization. Mark learned that Ranger rarely reacted without reason. If the dog hesitated, there was a reason. If Ranger growled, there was a reason. If Ranger refused to move, there was always a reason. And that reason was never small. In Cedar Ridge, Ranger became somewhat of a living legend. Students loved him, but they also respected the silent authority he carried. When Ranger walked through the hallway, even the rowdiest teens lowered their voices. Teachers joked that they needed him in their classrooms during finals week. But what made Ranger different wasn't his obedience. It was his intuition. There were stories, whispers among staff, moments no one fully explained. Like the time Ranger stopped in the cafeteria, staring at a janitor who was moments away from collapsing due to an undetected heart condition. Or the morning Ranger refused to enter the auditorium, and later, they discovered a broken gas valve behind the stage. It wasn't magic. Ranger wasn't supernatural. He was simply tuned into things humans ignored. So when Ranger stopped in front of locker 312, body stiff, ears sharp, chest barely moving, the shift was obvious. Something had caught his attention, something too subtle for the human senses, something he recognized instantly as wrong to everyone else. The hallway looked normal. To Ranger, it was not. Mark had seen that posture before, once, in the desert, seconds before an IED was uncovered. Only this time, the danger wasn't half a world away. It was inside a high school, behind a locker, and counting down. At first, Mark thought Ranger was simply picking up an old scent. Maybe a forgotten lunchbox, a sports bag left overnight, or even the lingering smell of fireworks from last week's pep rally. Ranger sometimes paused when scents overlapped in strange ways. But this wasn't a pause. This was a lock-on. Ranger's body entered a posture that only handlers with combat history could recognize. Head low, shoulders tense. Weight shifted to the back legs as if preparing to either leap or retreat. A stance built by instinct, not training. Mark crouched beside him, placing a steady hand on the dog's shoulder. "Hey, Ranger. Talk to me, buddy." Ranger didn't turn, didn't blink, didn't even flick an ear toward Mark's voice. He was listening, but not to Mark, to the wall. Students continued walking past, unaware of the tension gathering in the air like static before a storm. A boy wearing headphones laughed loudly at something on his phone. Two girls rushed by, chatting about an upcoming math quiz. Life moved as if nothing was wrong, because for everyone else, nothing was. But Ranger's breaths came sharper now, each inhale quick and deliberate, as if filtering something specific. His nostrils flared, the muscles along his spine tightened. His tail, usually relaxed, lowered until it hovered a breath above the floor. Then he did something Mark had only seen him do 3 times in their entire partnership. Ranger lifted one paw. Not a playful lift, not an impatient one. A signal. A trained indicator, used only when a dog detects the presence of explosive compounds or chemical irregularities. Dogs seldom raise that paw by mistake. It was the canine equivalent of a whisper. "Mark, something's here." A cold pinch tightened in Mark's chest. He scanned the locker. Ordinary green paint, small dents and scratches from years of backpack collisions. A few stickers peeling near the bottom. Just another locker on a long hallway of identical ones. But Ranger leaned closer, nose nearly pressed to the seam where 2 metal panels met. A faint vibration traveled through the dog's whiskers. He felt it before any human ear could. A micro tremble. A shift in the air pressure. Something internal, something mechanical. Ranger backed up 1 step and growled. Not loud, not aggressive, just low. So low, Mark felt it more than heard it. The kind of growl that came from instinct, buried deep in a species older than cities, older than schools, older than the concept of danger itself. It made Mark's stomach drop. He whispered, "Please don't let this be what I think it is." Ranger's eyes flicked to Mark for half a second, and in that brief glance, Mark saw confirmation. This wasn't random. This wasn't a false alert. This was the first sign that Cedar Ridge High School was sitting on a threat no one had seen coming. Mark straightened slowly, eyes never leaving Ranger. The hallway noise began to fade, not because it got quieter, but because Mark's senses tunneled the way they used to overseas, narrowing to the smallest details. Every instinct he'd trained, every memory he'd buried, suddenly woke up. He tugged gently on Ranger's leash. "Come on, buddy, let's step back." Ranger didn't budge. Instead, he stepped closer to the locker, pressing his nose against the thin seam. His ears twitched, catching something Mark couldn't yet hear. The dog's muscles rippled beneath his fur, coiled, ready. A nearby teacher, Mrs. Holloway, walked over with a pile of attendance sheets in her arms. "Officer Dalton, everything all right?" Before Mark could answer, Ranger let out a single, sharp bark. Not a warning bark, not a startled bark. This was different, deep, powerful, deliberate, a trained signal. Students jumped. Mrs. Holloway froze. Several kids who knew Ranger well exchanged uneasy glances because they had never heard him bark like that, not once. Mark lifted a hand to calm them. "It's okay, folks. Just stay back a little." But he knew it wasn't okay. Ranger lowered his head again, pushing his shoulder against the locker door as if testing its stability. Then he inhaled, long and controlled. The air around the dog suddenly felt heavier, tighter. Mark swore he saw Ranger's pupils narrow. The dog backed up half a step and barked again, one thunderous sound that echoed down the hall. This time, it wasn't ignorable. A custodian stepped out of the nearby janitor's closet. "What's going on?" Mark swallowed. His mouth had gone dry. "Ranger's alerting," he said quietly. Those 2 words carried weight. Real weight. Ranger didn't alert casually. If he reacted, it meant he detected something with chemical signatures similar to explosives or compounds that didn't belong in a locker. Mark pulled the radio from his belt, but hesitated. If he called a full alert, the entire school would go into lockdown within seconds. Panic, chaos, stampede-like movement in a hallway filled with over 600 kids. He needed one more confirmation. Just one. Ranger gave it to him. The dog planted both paws firmly, Shoulders squared, tail straight behind him. And he growled at the locker a second time, louder, vibrating the air. Mark finally heard it. Something metallic. Something faint. Coming from behind the locker wall. A tiny, uneven sound. Tick, tick, tick. The color drained from Mark's face. This wasn't a false alarm. This wasn't overreaction. This was the moment every EOD veteran fears. The moment instinct screams louder than logic. And Ranger had heard it first. The faint ticking should have been impossible to hear in a busy high school hallway. And yet, once Mark noticed it, he couldn't unhear it. It was irregular. Not a clock, not a phone vibration, not a piece of equipment settling in the wall. Something mechanical, something counting. Ranger's body pressed low, as if gravity itself had increased. His lips curled back just enough to show the tip of a canine tooth, a silent promise that whatever he sensed, he would not let it pass. Mark's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "We're escalating." He tapped his radio. "Dispatch, this is School Resource Unit 3. I need a supervisor near Hallway C. Possible suspicious—" Ranger snapped his head toward the wall, cutting him off. Not the locker, not the door, the wall behind it. The dog stepped sideways, sniffing along the cinder block, tracing some invisible trail. His breaths came faster now, not from fear, but from analysis, pulling in air from tiny cracks, filtering molecules the human nose would never detect. Several students had stopped walking entirely. A group of freshmen whispered nervously. Someone recorded a video on their phone, unsure whether this was going to end up on TikTok or the evening news. Mrs. Holloway clutched her attendance sheets tighter. "Officer Dalton, please, tell me this isn't—" "I don't know yet," Mark said, though the dread in his stomach suggested otherwise. Ranger suddenly pawed at the wall, claws scraping concrete. Mark's chest tightened. "Easy," he whispered urgently, placing a hand on Ranger's harness. "Not here. Not yet." But Ranger wasn't having it. He stepped back, barked, then lunged toward the wall again, this time pressing his full weight into the base of it, forcing Mark to take 2 quick steps to keep his balance. That did it. The hallway shifted. Not physically, emotionally. Students sensed something was wrong. Teachers began ushering kids away from lockers. Someone asked if they should evacuate. The principal's voice crackled from a classroom. "What's happening out there?" Mark knelt beside Ranger again. "What are you telling me, boy?" Ranger exhaled sharply, then stared straight into Mark's eyes. And in that moment, Mark saw something he hadn't seen since their days training together. Fear. Not panic, but recognition. Ranger knew this scent. Knew this vibration. Knew this pattern. And Mark did too. He whispered, "No. God, no." Ranger barked again, 3 times in rapid succession, the K9 explosive warning sequence. Every muscle in Mark's body tensed. He didn't need more confirmation. Whatever was inside that wall wasn't just suspicious. It was active. And the clock was running. Mark pressed his ear to the cool surface of the wall, blocking out the nervous whispers around him. For a breathless moment, all he heard was the thump of his own pulse. Then, tick, tick, tick. But this time it wasn't faint. It wasn't imagined. It had a rhythm, uneven, unnatural, metallic. Mark's stomach twisted. This wasn't the sound of a normal timer. This was the sound of a device put together by someone who didn't know what they were doing, or someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Ranger backed up 2 steps, positioning himself between Mark and the wall. A protective stance Mark had seen before. A stance that meant there is danger. And you are not getting any closer. Students now sensed the shift fully. The playful murmurs disappeared, replaced by silence heavy enough to feel. A teacher down the hall called out, voice trembling. "Everyone, please move to the cafeteria. Quietly." Mark stood, gripping his radio. His voice was steady, but inside, he felt that old, bitter reflex from Afghanistan. The one that whispered, "You know what this is. You've heard this before." "Dispatch, this is Dalton. I need immediate Code 3 assistance at Cedar Ridge High. Possible explosive device. Hallway C, start evacuation procedures." Before he finished the sentence, Ranger barked again, short, clipped, urgent, not a random alert. Not a panic reaction, a command. Mark whipped around. Ranger wasn't staring at the locker anymore. He was staring at the floor, the seam where the wall met the tiles, sniffing deeply, pawing at the edge. Mark's mind raced. No. No, no, no. Not layered. Please, not layered. A layered explosive setup was something only a few people would even consider. Someone who wanted multiple triggers, multiple fail points, or a diversion to pull attention away from the real danger. Ranger scratched again, harder this time. Mrs. Holloway clutched her chest. "Officer, is that—" "Everyone out," Mark barked. The softness was gone. Authority snapped into place. "Move, now." The hallway erupted into controlled chaos as teachers guided students away. But Ranger didn't move, didn't retreat, didn't even flinch. He was locked onto the base of the wall, nose trembling, body tight as a drawn bow. Mark knelt beside him one more time. "What do you smell, boy?" Ranger's lungs expanded slowly, pulling in air from a place no one else could detect. Then, a soft thump vibrated through the wall. Not an explosion, a shift, something adjusting in place. Ranger snarled. The fur along his spine lifted like a warning flare. Mark's blood ran cold. Because that noise, that subtle movement, meant only one thing. Whatever was behind that wall wasn't just counting down. It had started reacting. The moment that soft internal thump vibrated through the wall, Ranger reacted like he'd been shocked with electricity. He lunged forward, claws scraping violently against the painted cinder block. His bark was no longer controlled, no longer measured. This was a full-force alert. The kind a canine gave when there was no doubt left. Mark grabbed Ranger's harness with both hands to keep him from slamming his head against the wall. "Easy, easy, Ranger!" But Ranger wasn't listening. He was driven by fear, by instinct, by certainty. Then students screamed at the far end of the hallway, not because something happened near them, but because Ranger's desperate, guttural barks broke the last illusion that everything was fine. One bark, then another, then a rapid series of deep, ferocious warnings that shook the metal lockers around them. It was over. There was no more time for hesitation. Mark keyed his radio, voice sharp as a blade. "Dispatch. We have an active device. Repeat, active device, full evacuation. Lockdown protocol, send EOD now." Teachers yanked open classroom doors. Students flooded out in tight, organized waves. Administrators sprinted down the hallway with wide eyes. Someone pulled the fire alarm. The building became a hive of motion. But Ranger stayed locked on the wall, refusing to move even when students rushed past him. Mark knelt again, placing both hands on the dog's ribs to steady him. "What is it? What exactly are you telling me?" Ranger's nose pressed to a specific point, exact, focused, unwavering. A spot roughly the size of a shoebox, just above the floor. Mark knocked lightly. The sound that came back wasn't hollow like a locker. It was dense, layered, artificial. Then he heard it, clearly this time. Tick, tick, tick. The uneven mechanical pulse he knew all too well. Not from training videos, not from theory, from memory, from the desert, from nights spent crouched behind broken walls, listening for the sound that decided who lived and who didn't. His breath hitched. He pressed his palm to the wall, gently, feeling for vibration. It was there, faint but present, alive. "Oh my God," Mark whispered. and Ranger made the truth undeniable. The dog took a step back, lowered his head, and gave one long, shaking howl. A sound Mark had only heard once before, moments before his unit uncovered an IED disguised inside a mud brick wall. A sound that meant, "This is real. This is dangerous. And it is happening right now." Mark's eyes widened with sickening clarity. Someone hadn't put something in the locker. Someone had hidden something behind the wall. And it wasn't just a device. It was something designed to trigger something else. Ranger hadn't just found a threat. He had found the beginning of a system. The first EOD unit arrived faster than expected. 2 officers in heavy gear sprinting down the hall with a mobile toolkit. Ranger snarled as they approached, not out of aggression toward them, but because every second they wasted meant 1 second closer to whatever the ticking behind that wall intended. "Step back," one of the technicians ordered. Mark pulled Ranger with difficulty. The dog dug his claws into the tiles, refusing to budge, tail stiff, body trembling with tension. "He's not going to hurt you," Mark said breathlessly. "He's trying to tell you it's deeper than it looks." "Deeper how?" the tech asked. Before Mark could respond, Ranger barked, twice, toward the small hotspot he'd indicated earlier. The EOD tech placed a scope with a micro camera against the wall seam. The moment he looked at the monitor, his posture changed. "Oh no. Oh hell no." "What is it?" Mark snapped. "This wall has been tampered with. Someone cut into the hollow inside, placed a secondary unit, then patched the surface to look solid. This isn't a locker problem. This is structural." Ranger yanked forward again, nearly pulling Mark off balance. "Hold him!" the tech shouted. "He's alerting to something else," Mark said, voice cracking from the rush of adrenaline. "You need to check lower." The tech moved the camera downward. What appeared on the feed made him freeze. Inside the wall, behind the plaster, behind the framing, a small makeshift trigger was wired crudely but intentionally. It wasn't sophisticated, but it didn't need to be. It only needed to complete a single electric loop. "What's it connected to?" Mark demanded. The tech swallowed hard. "Nothing in here." Ranger barked sharply, then swung his head toward the opposite end of the hallway, the direction of the school gym. Mark's heart dropped. "No, don't tell me." A second tech ran up, breathless. "We scanned the adjacent hallway to check for structural compromise. There's wiring running underneath the floor tiles, leading toward the athletic wing." Mark closed his eyes for one devastating second. The gym. The morning assembly would have started in less than half an hour. Hundreds of kids, teachers, staff. This wasn't a single device. This was a decoy, a smaller charge meant to draw attention to the lockers, to the hallway, to the wrong danger. The real threat was somewhere else. Ranger growled deep in his chest, staring straight down the hallway like he could already see the path danger had taken. Mark's voice came out hoarse. "We've been looking at the wrong place," the technician nodded grimly. "And if that primary device is active," Ranger barked again, urgent, desperate. Mark didn't need more explanation. "We need to get to the gym," he said. "Now." And Ranger leapt forward, pulling Mark into a full sprint, straight toward the real bomb. Ranger tore down the hallway with a force Mark had never felt before, not even in their most intense training sessions. The dog's paws hammered against the linoleum, claws scraping for traction as he lunged forward, dragging Mark behind him in a dead sprint. "Move! Move!" Mark shouted, as teachers and students scattered out of the way. But Ranger didn't hesitate. Didn't look left, didn't look right. His entire body was an arrow, pointed directly toward the gym. The EOD team rushed after them, shouting into radios, calling for a full evacuation of the athletic wing. Administrators scrambled to redirect crowds. Someone pulled a fire alarm again, though the sound was already drowned out by the pounding in Mark's ears. Ranger reached the gym entrance and skidded sharply, nose hitting the floor, inhaling hard. He whined, a broken, urgent sound, and bolted toward the bleachers. "Under there!" Mark gasped. Ranger barked once, short, clipped, absolute. The EOD tech slid onto his stomach, flashlight in hand. A second later, he cursed. "Found it! Backpack! Wires! Timer active! This one's the primary." "How long?" Mark demanded. The tech leaned in again, then looked up with a face drained of color. "Minutes. Maybe less." Ranger growled at the device as if trying to warn it away, then paced in a tight circle, agitation rising. He wasn't afraid. He was trying to keep everyone back. Mark recognized it instantly. Ranger had seen this before, smelled this before, felt this before. The dog was responding like a soldier who remembered old nightmares too well. "Clear the gym," Mark ordered. "Now." Teachers herded students toward emergency exits. Kids sprinted through doors that banged against walls. The gym emptied in seconds, but Ranger stayed low, staring at the device under the bleachers as though holding it in place with sheer will. One of the EOD techs reached for his kit. "We can disarm it, but I need time." Time they didn't have. Suddenly, Ranger lunged closer to the bleachers, barking with such ferocity it rattled the metal frame. Mark grabbed him around the torso. "No, not you. Not this time." But Ranger thrashed, muscles iron hard, refusing to be pulled away. Ranger wasn't trying to stop the tech. He was trying to stop Mark. Because Ranger knew something Mark didn't. The device wasn't just counting down. It was unstable. And every second they stood there was a second too long. The EOD tech's hands shook as he positioned his tools beneath the bleachers. One glance told him everything he needed to know. The device wasn't just unstable. It was angry. Wires twisted together in ways that made no engineering sense, taped over with layers of electrical tape. Someone had built it fast, sloppy, and desperate. The most dangerous combination. "Everyone out except the K9 team!" the tech shouted. But Ranger wasn't listening. His instincts were screaming louder than any order. The dog suddenly shoved his body between Mark and the bleachers, pushing him back with surprising force. Mark stumbled, caught off guard. "Ranger! Stop! What are you?" Ranger growled. Not at the bomb, not at the tech, but at Mark. A deep, vibrating sound that came from the part of a dog that knows danger humans can't comprehend. It wasn't aggression. It was command. "Stay back. Do not come closer." Mark froze. He saw it. The tremor in Ranger's muscles, the rapid breaths, the way the dog's paws spread wide to brace himself. Ranger's eyes never left the device. That unwavering stare held something Mark had never seen from him before. Acceptance. "Ranger," Mark whispered, voice breaking. "No. You're not doing this. You're not." A sudden crack echoed from the wall behind them, drywall shifting under pressure. Then a shower of plaster dust rained down from above. The small decoy charge hidden inside the wall, the one they'd all forgotten about, was destabilizing. The tech shouted, "We have movement! It's reacting to vibrations! Everyone back!" Mark grabbed Ranger's harness again, desperate. But Ranger twisted, planting his weight, refusing to be moved. Then, boom! A sharp, concussive pop erupted from the hallway outside, the decoy device, sending a powerful shockwave through the gym's walls. It wasn't a deadly blast, but it was enough to make the bleachers shudder violently. In the same instant, a metal support bar above them snapped. Mark reacted an instant too slow. Ranger didn't. With a burst of instinct older than civilization, Ranger hurled himself into Mark's chest, knocking him off balance and shoving him toward the far wall. The support bar crashed down, slamming into the floor exactly where Mark had been standing. Pain streaked up Ranger's back leg. He yelped. a short, clipped sound he tried to swallow. But he stayed standing between Mark and the bomb, trembling, panting, wounded. Mark's heart felt like it cracked open. Ranger wasn't just alerting anymore. He was shielding him. And for the first time that day, Mark realized the truth. Ranger wasn't afraid to die. He was afraid to let Mark die. For several seconds, after the support bar slammed onto the gym floor, everything dissolved into a ringing silence. Dust drifted through the air like pale snow, illuminated by the emergency lights. Mark could barely hear anything except the heavy pound of his own heartbeat and Ranger's labored breaths. "Ranger! Ranger, look at me!" Mark crawled toward him, hands shaking. Ranger tried to put weight on his injured back leg and collapsed. The sound that left Mark's throat wasn't a word. It was a broken, animal cry pulled from a place inside him he hadn't opened since the war. EOD officers rushed in. Medics sprinted across the gym. Someone yelled for a stretcher. Students outside the building stood gathered behind police tape, some crying, some praying, all whispering about the dog that had saved them. But Ranger only cared about one thing, Mark. The dog lifted his head, pushing his snout weakly into Mark's palm. His ears flattened, his tail thumped once against the floor. Slow, soft, apologetic, as if he were sorry for worrying him. "Oh, buddy, I've got you." Mark pressed his forehead against Ranger's. "You did your job. You did more than anyone could have asked." A medic knelt beside them. "He's in pain, but he's stable. We need to get him to the emergency vet now. The leg might be fractured." Mark nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "I'm going with him." The medic hesitated. "Officer, you're injured too. Your shoulder." "I'm going," Mark repeated, voice unshakable. Ranger let out a soft whine, nudging Mark again as if to comfort him instead. As they loaded Ranger onto the stretcher, students nearby began to clap. Not the kind of applause for a pep rally, not noisy or excited, but a quiet, heartfelt rhythm. Hundreds of palms tapping together in gratitude. A girl with freckles sobbed into her friend's shoulder. A senior football player wiped his cheek with the back of his hand. A teacher whispered, "He saved our children." Word spread fast. News vans began to gather. The sheriff arrived personally just to shake Mark's hand. But Mark barely heard any of it. His world had narrowed to the ambulance where Ranger lay wrapped in blankets, eyes half closed yet still watching him. Always watching him. At the emergency veterinary clinic, surgeons worked for nearly 2 hours. Mark paced the waiting room like a caged animal. His shoulder throbbed, but he didn't care. He replayed every moment in his head. The growl, the bark, the shove that knocked him out of harm's way. He kept thinking one thing. It should have been me, not him. Finally, the vet, Dr. Chen, stepped into the room. Mark stood instantly. "He's alive," Dr. Chen said with a soft smile. Mark's knees almost buckled. "The leg wasn't shattered, just a clean fracture. We repaired it. With rest and physical therapy, he should regain full function." Mark exhaled a trembling breath he'd been holding for hours. "Can I see him?" "Of course." Ranger lay on a heated recovery pad, hooked to fluids, his breathing steady. When he saw Mark, his tail tapped faintly, weak but determined. Mark knelt beside him, stroking his fur gently. "You're my hero," he whispered, "and you always will be." Ranger closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. Not because he was tired, but because he finally felt safe. For the first time since the ticking began, the world was still. 2 weeks passed. Spring sunlight returned to Cedar Ridge, melting the last thin patches of snow from the parking lot. The school reopened. Students walked a little slower in the hallways. Teachers held each other a little longer in morning greetings. And outside the main entrance, a small memorial of hand-drawn cards, flowers, and stuffed animals grew each day, every note addressed to the same name: Thank you, Ranger. Inside the veterinary clinic, Mark visited Ranger every morning before work. Ranger had a cast on his hind leg and a long, shaved patch along his side. But he greeted Mark with the same quiet dignity he always had. The vet staff adored him. He'd become something of a local celebrity, though Ranger never understood why strangers waved at him through the glass. He only cared when Mark walked into the room. On the 10th day of recovery, Dr. Chen smiled as Ranger placed weight, carefully, on his injured leg for the first time. "He's healing fast," she said. "Faster than most dogs with his injury. He's determined." "That's him," Mark replied softly. "He always pushes through." That weekend, the school held a small ceremony in the gym, the very same gym Ranger had saved. They invited Mark, the EOD technicians, and the entire K-9 unit. Chairs filled the court. Students held small American flags. On the wall, a banner read, "Our Guardian of Cedar Ridge." When Mark entered with Ranger at his side, moving slowly but proudly, the entire gym rose in a standing ovation. The applause was thunderous. Some students cried openly. Ranger paused, ears perked, unsure what all the noise meant. Mark knelt beside him. "It's for you," he whispered. "All of this is for you." Ranger sniffed the air, then pressed his head gently into Mark's chest. The principal stepped forward, voice trembling. "Today, we honor courage. Not the kind found on battlefields, though this courage certainly could have been, but the courage of instinct, loyalty, and love. Cedar Ridge stands today because Ranger would not move, because he listened to something none of us could hear." A silver medal hung from a blue ribbon glinted in the principal's hands. "For extraordinary bravery and service, we present Ranger with the Cedar Ridge Medal of Valor." Mark accepted the medal on Ranger's behalf, though he clipped it gently to the dog's harness so the students could see. Ranger looked down at it once, then looked back at Mark, as if saying, "What matters is that you're safe." The gym erupted again. Later, after the ceremony, Ranger walked, slowly, down the hall where everything had started. The repaired wall bore a small plaque, "In honor of Ranger, whose instincts saved us all." Ranger paused in front of the plaque, sniffed it, then surprised everyone. He sat. The same calm, steady sit he had given the day he sensed the ticking. But this time, he wasn't warning anyone. He was remembering. Mark placed a hand on his back. "It's over, buddy. You did good." Ranger leaned into him, exhaling softly. And for the first time since the chaos, Mark noticed something he'd missed. The hallway, filled with students laughing, footsteps echoing, lockers closing, felt normal again, safe again, alive again. Because of one dog, because of one instinct, because sometimes heroes don't need uniforms or badges. They just need 4 paws, a beating heart, and the courage to listen to the silence. In a world filled with noise, chaos, and moments when danger hides where we least expect it, Ranger reminded us of something powerful, something ancient. Sometimes the bravest warnings come from the ones who cannot speak, only feel. Ranger didn't save Cedar Ridge because he was trained to. He saved them because he cared. Because loyalty is a language deeper than words. Because a dog's heartbeat often knows the truth long before our minds ever catch up. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of their kind. They walk beside us, they guard us without question, and when darkness approaches, they stand in front of it. If Ranger's story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the courage, instinct, and love our animals give us every day, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Pawprints of Valor. Because every paw print has a story, and every hero, no matter how small or silent, deserves to be remembered.